Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Responds. Welcome to the Monday edition of Balance of Power as we see Tehran's initial retaliation to U.S. attacks over the weekend on its nuclear facilities. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thank you for joining us on the Monday edition of Balance of Power with reports now, Kailey, of 10 missiles being fired by Iran at U.S. bases in the region, specifically our airbase in Qatar. Explosions heard in Doha. This is just the beginning.
Yeah, keeping in mind the airbase to which we are referring, Udeid Air Base, houses thousands of U.S. troops in addition to Qatari and Royal Air Force forces. It is also the headquarters of U.S. Central Command. This is our biggest military installation in the Middle East. And of course, President Trump may feel compelled to respond if indeed there are any casualties that result from these missiles being fired in its direction. Remembering the president warned over this weekend any retaliation will be met with force, quote, far greater than what was witnessed during the initial U.S. strike over the weekend.
That's right. And it's at this hour that President Trump was set to meet with his national security team. Reports suggesting they're already in the Situation Room with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who briefed us yesterday morning following those initial attacks against Iran. It does call into question whether there will be more of a tit for tat here. Kailey, Wall Street's watching this. Early gains have evaporated with this news.
Yeah, so let's get a check now on that market reaction and turn to Amy Morris, who is tracking things from here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Absolutely right, Kailey. Thank you. Stocks falling on reports of that Iranian response to U.S. attacks on its nuclear site. Sources saying that the attack included at least 6 missiles fired toward the U.S. base in Qatar. And Axios is reporting Iran launched 10 missiles at U.S. bases in both Qatar and Iraq. Now, we are going to be checking the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is down 0.1%. NASDAQ down 0.1%. And the Dow now down 0.3%. Worth noting here that both the S&P and NASDAQ have erased all gains for the day. They're now in the red. Oil shipments through the Straits of Hormuz holding up for now. NYMEX crude oil down 2.3%. Brent crude is down 2.4%. We're watching that for you as well. Tariffs on pharmaceuticals could wind up costing Ireland, which is a multinational hub for Pfizer and Eli Lilly, up 75,000 jobs. The finance minister there is warning tensions in the Middle East. Everything we're watching happening now is also adding risk in the energy and trade sectors and impacting the pharmaceutical industry. Shares of Pfizer 0.8% lower. Eli Lilly shares 0.3% higher. Novo Nordisk ending its partnership with Hims and Hers Health because of what the drug company calls deceptive marketing of copycat versions of Novo's obesity drug, Wegovy. Shares of Hims and Hers Health now down 33%. We're going to keep an eye on all of this for you throughout the day. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris keeping track of the markets for us. Thank you so much. Meantime, here on Balance of Power, we are keeping track of the headlines out of the Middle East. As we already said, there have been reports of 10 missiles being fired at U.S. bases in Qatar specifically. And now Iranian state television is saying that a, quote, powerful, devastating strike was launched at Al Udeid Air Force Air Base. That, of course, is the biggest U.S. military installation in the Middle East. It is the headquarters of U.S. Central Command. And Iranian state TV has cited an IRGC statement on the missile strike heading toward Qatar. We knew, Joe, that retaliation was likely coming. Iran's Armed Forces Chief of Staff earlier today said it would be proportionate and decisive. I guess we're getting a sense of what the regime's take on proportionate and decisive actually is.
That's right. It's been a flurry of headlines over the past hour or so. Now, Iran, according to Axios, launching at least one missile toward Iraq, where there's also a large military base, but not nearly the number of U.S. troops who are there. If reports are correct, they're already in the Situation Room at the White House, and there was a scheduled meeting for the president and his national security team at this hour. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is joining us with the very latest from the North Lawn at the White House. Tyler?
Yeah, hey, Joe. Well, as you mentioned, we are expecting that President Trump has already convened his National Security Council inside the Oval Office. We should say that this was always on the public schedule, but now we could see perhaps some sort of confirmation out of the White House as we wait to see if any officials make some sort of statement when it comes to the reports of these missiles being launched towards that U.S. airbase in Qatar. Now, we should say, as Kailey had mentioned at the top, retaliation was widely expected, considering that we had heard from the Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces earlier today saying that a response would ultimately be disproportionate. And we had been tracking moves when it came to Qatar. We know that they had suspended flights over their airspace earlier today. The U.S. Embassy there had also warned that Americans should start to shelter in place. Of course, as mentioned, this is one of the largest U.S. military bases in the Middle East. It's home to about 9,000 U.S. service members. Now, this White House has maintained that it had been proactive about protecting U.S. assets in the region. Of course, you'll recall last week we saw them move personnel out of Iraq. But now the question really does become, would this provoke further U.S. retaliation? President Trump had threatened that there could be further attacks if Iran did not come to the negotiating table when it comes to their nuclear program. But Joe and Kailey, we have heard reiterated by Iranian officials that they are not going to be able to negotiate if the strikes do continue against them. Of course, that then begs the question about a potential ceasefire, which up to this point we really haven't seen President Trump be too in favor of. Of course, we have heard him say before that he is looking for what he calls unconditional surrender.
Well, as we consider what response the president may choose for this action, we should note that Qatar is now saying that it intercepted that missile barrage on Al Udeid Air Base. Qatar says there was no incident and no casualties from the missile attack, and that could be important in the considerations of the Trump administration as it decides whether or not to retaliate if there were indeed no casualties from this attack. Again, this is coming from Qatar. We'll have to await word from the White House as well, Tyler. But if indeed we were to see an additional military action that this administration wants to take, is there a sense that they might go to Congress for approval for that in a way they did not with this strike over this past weekend?
Well, up to this point, Kailey, this White House has really maintained that it has complied with the War Powers Act of 1973. We're going to hear this talked about a lot in Congress, as there does appear to be some sort of a movement, even among Republicans who were upset about President Trump moving forward with this authorization of military force without congressional approval. But we heard from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who really has maintained that they have complied with that law. And we should say that presidents of both parties in the past have authorized military strikes without congressional approval. But that really does become one of the factors here as the White House does weigh its decision moving forward. Yet President Trump has been pretty staunch in his rhetoric when it comes to making sure that he is protecting U.S. interests abroad if there were to be some sort of retaliation. We're going to be watching really closely as how this does play out, because our analysts at Bloomberg had been expecting perhaps a more targeted strike. So we'll see. You're reading the headlines there from Qatar about what potentially the damage could ultimately be. But there were a few different options that Iran did have on the table. So we'll be watching to see if this expands any further and what this White House's response would be.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us as we contend with this breaking news. Thank you so much. And again, to reiterate, as Qatar says it has successfully intercepted Iran's missile attack, it is also Qatari response we have to consider here, as Qatar is saying it reserves the right to respond to this, quote, blatant attack from Iran. And of course, that's just one player in the region that is factored in here as well. The other being, of course, Israel, as it continues its own strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure and other assets. And Iran has fired retaliatory missiles at Israel in return. We have seen that for days. We saw it again, once again today. And an important voice is joining us now here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm pleased to say Yoav Gallant, the former defense minister of Israel, is with us live. Sir, we appreciate your time as we consider this response from Iran targeting U.S. military assets in the region. Is this in keeping with what you expected? Do you think it ends here, or could we still see yet more from the regime?
Well, good afternoon, Joe and Kailey. Thank you for having me. And I think that the bold decision that was taken by the president and the excellent performances of the American Air Force, and nobody else, no Air Force in the world can do anything similar to that. This is an essential step in order to make sure that Iran will not possess nuclear weapon. Imagine that one of these ballistic missiles that was shot to Qatar, to Israel, could have carried a weapon of mass destruction. This can be a disaster, not only for the region, but for the world. Therefore, we need to avoid it. And in this meaning, in this region, in the Middle East, peace comes through strength. Unfortunately, you need to explain the aggressor that there are limits to what they can do. And the Iranians were very, very close to possess a nuclear weapon.
We'd like to know more about what could happen next, Mr. Gallant, based on the extent that you're still in touch with your contacts. How broad and at what scale could be this response from Iran? We have reports of 10 missiles in the air. So far, it appears those fired toward Qatar have been intercepted. Will Iran need to resort to terrorism if it cannot strike militarily against the U.S.?
I think that the major tool that Iran has and will try to use is ballistic missiles, also other type of missiles and drones. And they are shooting them against Israel in the recent 2 years, and especially during the last week. And I believe they made a grave mistake by retaliating against American base and American interests, because I'm sure that the president will retaliate or order to retaliate exactly as he promised in the past. And the proportions between the Iranian capabilities and the Americans are bringing Iran to a very low point, to the corner. And I think that the Central Command, CENTCOM of the U.S. Army will retaliate against them in order to explain what is the meaning of such a behavior. But we are lucky that all these missiles were intercepted in the air. And let me say that for me, the lives of Americans and the life of American soldiers are as dear as the life of Israeli soldiers. I started to train with American soldiers when I was commanding the Navy SEALs, the Israeli Navy SEAL, 40 years ago. And I appreciate them, and they are very dear for me, and I value very much their performances and their abilities. And we will do anything that we can in order to support American efforts, intel and anything else needed.
Well, General, as we consider the support that Israel might need and has gotten from the U.S., while Qatar has successfully intercepted this attack from Iran, obviously not all of the missiles and et cetera that Iran has sent Israel's way over the course of the last week or so have been intercepted. How should we consider Israel's own air defense capability if Iran were to introduce more advanced missiles into this fighting? Is that something Israel is prepared for and can withstand for potentially a prolonged period of time?
Oh, yeah. You know, this war started recently, but last autumn, on September, we eliminated Hezbollah. And on October, we made two major steps when we retaliate against Iranian aggression when they were shooting at us 200 ballistic missiles on October 1st. We retaliate, and actually we create and pave the way for what we are seeing now. Once we almost demolish all their ability to manufacture ballistic missiles, so they stay with the arsenal they have, around 2,000, maybe 2,500 ballistic missiles when they start with. And second, we were able to pave the way to Tehran and to create a corridor, and later on air superiority that also was part of the assist that we gave to the Americans when they hit Fordo. So looking on the situation, the Iranian will suffer heavy damage and heavy casualties, and everything that is either Revolutionary Guard or military bases or regime bases. This all is exposed to Israeli and American potential retaliation. So in one hand, we are well equipped to protect ourselves. We are able to engage and detect the missile launchers on the ground, and we are doing it successfully. We degraded them from 400 to, I believe, less than 200. And with America retaliating from bases and carriers, I think that the Iranians are in a very bad position. And that means that for them, they should stop and accept the conditions that President Trump put on the table. Otherwise, we will do it by force. But you cannot allow a country that is based on irresponsible regime to possess nuclear weapon in the center of the Gulf.
You mentioned Fordo. It is possible the IAEA will never get inside Fordo, and there are questions in Washington and around the world about the extent to which the U.S. eliminated the entire facility or whether there could be something left over. Will Israeli special forces go there firsthand, in person, to find out?
Well, Fordo is a few hundred feet under the surface.
Yeah. Can you access that facility in person?
We know this. We know these places, and we know what was going over there. We believe that the American mob that was dropped from the B-2s was penetrating Fordo, and America has the ability to retake those places if needed. Anyhow, I think that the whole system under the ground was collapsed, together with what was happening in Natanz and with other facilities that are dealing with the Iranian nuclear program in Isfahan and in Kashan, Natanz, and other places. I think that we set them back by many years. And if you look on the general picture, including what happened to the protecting shells that they created in the past, like Hezbollah and Hamas and the Syrians, everything collapsed, including the Iranian air defense. So they are very exposed. And the regime is fighting for their life. And this is the reason, I believe, that they need to retaliate. Otherwise, the 90 million Iranians will understand that the regime is very weak, and this is an option to change the regime by the people in Iran. Therefore, they need to show strength to their own people. But it's a grave mistake because they are going to lose more and more assets because of those reactions. Every day, we are setting them back by a few months.
Well, as you allude to the idea of regime change here, do you believe that is Israel's ultimate objective in this war or this conflict? Do you believe there's alignment between Israel and the U.S. in that regard?
I don't think that this is a declared aim, a declared goal of war. The goal of the war is to make sure that Iran will never possess nuclear weapon and to destroy their ability to produce fissile material and weapon system that activate it by eliminate the scientists and the centers that deal with that. But having said that, air campaign cannot change a regime. But on the other hand, it weakened the regime, and in this aspect, it gives the people of Iran the opportunity to change the regime if this will be their choice. We cannot, and I don't think that we are aiming to change the regime from the air campaign. But the international media, together with the people in Iran, and the air campaign that Israel and the United States are holding against Iran, can create conditions for the people in Iran.
Mm-hmm. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube or Bloomberg Originals, we're showing you the first video that we have of missiles being shot toward Qatar, where they were intercepted. This is home to the massive U.S. airbase that we've been describing, and the Iranian retaliation, if you're just joining us, that began shortly after 12 noon Eastern time. Yoav Gallant, in our final moment of conversation, do you expect that we'll see Israeli forces on the ground in Iran?
I don't think so. I don't think it is needed, and I'm not sure that the effect of it is something that is needed. Iran is a big place, huge comparing to Israel. It's 60 or 65 times larger than Israel. The population is 9 times bigger. The Iranian people are not our enemy, and we are fighting to eliminate their ability to possess nuclear weapon, because on every missile it is written death to Israel and also death to America. And if they possess nuclear weapon, they will use it. Therefore, as a Holocaust survivor's son, a son of a Holocaust survivors, for me, never again is not just a commitment. For me, never again is a manual. We are working according to it, and we need to make sure that those who threat to eliminate Israel, and by the same words, the Jewish people, who majority of it stay in Israel, the meaning is that they are serious about it. So we need to take preemptive actions, and that's what we are doing.
He is the former defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant. General, thank you for the time and insights today on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. If you're just joining us, Iran is now retaliating following the U.S. attacks against its nuclear installations over the weekend. This is video that we've just received from Qatar, with, you see, the missiles being intercepted over our airbase in Qatar. There are also reports that another, at least single ballistic missile has been shot toward our base in Iraq. At 19 minutes past the hour local time in Jerusalem, we turn to Dan Williams, Bloomberg News reporter in Jerusalem, with his view of what's happening on the ground there. Dan, what is the feeling as we enter another nighttime in Israel, knowing that Iran is punching back?
Well, good afternoon. I think it's clear that the circle of retaliation has now widened. This is not a great surprise, and clearly U.S. forces in those Gulf countries were braced for it, because it appears that these launches were bloodless. Obviously, we will have to await final word on that. So the big question is whether this was a pro forma retaliation by Iran, basically meant to be registered in the pages of history and then put behind all the parties involved. Possibly that's something the Americans and the Gulf parties involved will be agreeable to. But again, the big question is whether there was damage, significant damage, and especially casualties, because it would be harder to overlook something like that and not to retaliate for this retaliation. From Israel, I think this is anticipated. One thing that's worth noting is there appears to have been a ticking clock on Iran's ability to conduct this, because according to the Israelis, 80% of Iran's launches, missile launches, have now been destroyed by Israeli actions in the past 9-10 days. And it would appear that if that pace continues, within a day or two, Iran will no longer have the means to launch such missiles. So it's not only inevitable, perhaps it was pressing in terms of time, and something that could only have been expected today or at the latest tomorrow.
We're getting reporting out of the New York Times now, Dan, that Iran gave advance notice to Qatar on its planned attack on the U.S. base, which could have played into the fact that Qatar was able to successfully intercept all of these missiles. But we also had Iran's Supreme National Security Council specifically saying that its attack was far from residential areas in Qatar, that it remains committed to warm relations with Qatar. How should we consider not just what this means in terms of the U.S. and Israel and its ongoing contact with Iran, but other players in the Gulf who have now been brought into this, for better or worse?
Well, I think Qatar is especially interesting because, as you know, it's arguably the Gulf Arab country that is closest to Iran. It seems on the face of it very unusual, uncanny even, that the Iranians would choose this as the country, or at least the host country, of a target for a retaliatory attack. Nonetheless, the Americans have a major base of operations in Qatar. It's not just an American base of operations, it's also a fusion center for where the United States and its partners, including Israel, bring in information about missile launches that have to be shot down. They actually coordinate aerial defense, regional air defense through Qatar. So it would, in terms of cold-eyed military reasoning, that would seem a sensible or an expected place to direct retaliation. At the same time, Iran will not be in a rush to lose any friends over this, especially a country that has been close to it and useful in many regards. Hence, I think the rhetoric and the forewarning and the sense, I think, that this, as I said, was largely a pro forma retaliation, a one-off that perhaps was intended not to cause serious damage or casualties.
Yeah. Dan, we've got a headline running now. Bahrain is closing its airspace temporarily. We could see this cascading throughout the region all night, correct?
Correct. And keep in mind, it's a fairly small piece of land. There's a possibility of spillover if parties end up shooting, sending planes over and the like. I think obviously there's a lot of caution, especially as it's an energy nexus, that part of the world. So the natural instability that comes with coming under a ballistic missile attack is magnified when you are in the business of oil export or oil transport. The same for natural gas, of course. So yes, that's to be anticipated. There'll be jitters across the region now. But again, if everyone understands that this was a one-off, you can expect that as well, that sense of a brace for more, that to be lifted and eased in short order.
Well, in addition to Bahrain, a person familiar with the matter now says the UAE has confirmed its airspace is closed, so speaks to the broader kind of regional spillover effect that you were alluding to, Dan. On your point on energy, though, I would note right now we are seeing on both WTI and Brent crude futures down about 4.6%, an actual move lower in oil, which suggests perhaps the market is seeing the idea that Iran has decided to take action against U.S. military assets rather than, say, the Strait of Hormuz may be a good signal. But is the market wise to read things that way? Could Iran still not pick a both-and strategy?
I think the market is wise. I think the Iranians are very, very short on viable options for retaliation. Anything they do, I'll paraphrase the American Secretary of State. He talked about economic suicide for Iran in the event it decides to close off the strait, given that Iran is a major energy exporter as well. So again, nonetheless, the Iranians appear to need, at least in terms of domestic consumption, in terms of a face-saving measure, in terms of honoring or shoring up a regime that really has been battered in recent days. They need at least to register that they've carried out some kind of retaliation. The question is whether they're willing to effectuate and tolerate further escalation should the Americans decide to answer this blow with a blow in return.
All right, Bloomberg's Dan Williams reporting from Jerusalem. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. Again, we're grappling with headlines out of the Middle East here as we're seeing more airspace closures in the UAE and Bahrain. And of course, news from Qatar that Iran did send missiles toward the Al Udeid air base in Qatar, though Qatar says that they intercepted all of those missiles successfully and that there were no casualties. We'll, of course, have to await confirmation on that. And as we do so, we bring in now our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Rick, of course, Stonecourt Capital partner and Republican strategist. Jeanne, our Democratic analyst and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, if there were indeed no casualties as a result of at least this particular instance of Iranian retaliation, do you expect President Trump will be expected or compelled to respond in kind?
You know, that's really, I think, a strategic decision that the president and his national security staff's going to have to make, because it's pretty clear that this was a show me kind of attack, right? You know, we call in advance, we're going to shoot over 10 missiles, make sure you pick them up over the Gulf of Hormuz and knock them down. We don't want to kill anybody. You can't evacuate 9,000 people at Al Udeid. So, you know, it's as much a ballet of retribution as it is anything else. And at the same time, it's also a good excuse for Donald Trump, if he wants to escalate, to do so. If he wants to put more impact on Iran to come to the table, you know, this would be the opening to do it if force is that motivator. My guess is he'll still be committed to some kind of peaceful solution. He knows that's the only ultimate goal that can be achievable within his sort of ideological partnership called MAGA. And so I wouldn't be surprised that he takes the opportunity to say, okay, you know, Israel is going to do its thing to keep pounding away at these missile sites, and I'm going to open up the dialogue for peace. It is not to be missed that Pakistan today nominated Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize in his resolution of the conflict between India and Pakistan. So I'm sure he has that peacemaker role in mind today as it started.
Well, it strikes me as well, Jeanne, that this president will have to choose very carefully his next steps when it comes to the support of MAGA, knowing that there were great concerns about this turning into a wider war. When the president considers the likes of Steve Bannon and Tucker Carlson, the idea of keeping this limited to a series of isolated strikes could change very quickly based on what he does next. How much will that weigh on his final call?
I think it'll weigh on his final call. He's been in communication, we know, with Steve Bannon. So far, I've been looking at what Steve Bannon has said. He has been, muted in his response. He has not attacked the president or, sort of launched a sort of Tucker Carlson-like diatribe against this action. But we have to wait to see how this turns out. Somebody the president is watching is Marjorie Taylor Greene, and she is very closely connected with that MAGA wing, and she has been speaking out very strongly. So he's sure going to take notice of that. And of course, as we watch his truths, we know he is not very happy with Tom Massey. He never is, but in particular now, in terms of his response, all of that's going to weigh on the president. But the reality is the president made his decision late last week. This is a president who is not an isolationist. He is an interventionist. This is an attack and a war of choice on the part of the president. There's nobody in the international community or at home who could say that this was an imminent threat being faced by Iran, even our own national security community. And so he made a choice, and maybe it was the right choice, but he made the choice to go in, and he's certainly not going to step back from that. I do think his response to these 10 missiles, that was very limited on the part of Iran, will likely be equally measured. Just by comparison's sake, they sent 200 missiles the night after Israel attacked. So this is a very limited symbolic response on their part. And the bigger question now is not what they do in the short term, but how they respond in the long term, and whether, in fact, the president was successful in taking out their nuclear program for the long term.
Rick, as Jeanne there just described President Trump as an interventionist, despite campaigning on what could have been easily described as an isolationist America First platform, he also campaigned, of course, on being a better steward for the U.S. economy and specifically bringing inflation and price pressures down. And as we look at oil now down 5% on both Brent and WTI, we're looking at a 70 handle on WTI once again, as the market kind of sees this as being good news, at least for global energy trade. How much does that also factor into his decision making, that he does not want to see a situation in which we see a spike in oil prices and therefore by extension prices at the pump?
Yeah, I think universally this administration, Donald Trump's president, is really concerned that they have not done a good enough job bringing down consumer prices. And obviously, because of these conflicts that have been ongoing now for some time in the Middle East, probably the least difficult one, or the most difficult one, has been the price of gas. Even though we are insulated in a way that we've never been in the past conflicts in the Middle East by being a net exporter of oil and refined products, it's still impacting our price structure, as you point out. So at the end of the day, it's definitely a motivator. It's what will transcend this skirmish in the Middle East. A year from now, we won't be talking about this potentially, but we will be talking about the price of consumer products and gasoline. And I can promise you that every midterm election rally that we anticipate Donald Trump holding, he's going to talk about how much better off you are today than you were under Joe Biden, and that's going to include prices.
What do you make of this reaction, Jeanne, on Wall Street? I know you're not a stock strategist or a commodities trader here, but this is pretty remarkable when we consider what we're seeing right now. Crude oil prices are sharply lower, down 5%. Stocks have resumed their climb. You're looking at the Dow up 230, the S&P 500 up 40 points. With missiles in the air, the idea that we've been hearing, according to analysts, is that Wall Street believes that the great existential threat of the last 30 years has been eliminated. No matter what happens from here, the fact that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. Is that something that you can get your head around, knowing that this could go in so many different ways from here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of Iran's limited response right now, the market is right to read this as limited. And I think that they're hoping or betting that the president's response will be equally muted. The reality, though, is I'm sorry to say the market is wrong at this point because we don't know how successful the U.S. attack was. And we can't underscore that enough. We had an objective to wipe out their ability to have a nuclear program. And there is nobody, if you talk to people in the international community, who believes that that has been completely wiped out. You know why? Because you can't bomb away the knowledge that Iranians have when it comes to building a nuclear program in the long term. And whether Khomeini is in there or not, anybody who comes into that leadership and in Iran and looks around says, we are living amidst surrounded by Sunni nations. Our neighbors are Israel, our neighbors are Afghanistan, Pakistan, who Rick just talked about, nominated Donald Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize today, Saudi Arabia. They will likely say to themselves, and it would be understandable, that we are going to go underground and continue with the knowledge that we have and build up our program again in the long term. And oh, by the way, we still have a question. Where did their uranium go? The United States has not been able to tell us that at this point, and the international community can't. So I think betting that this is done and we were successful and we have a denuclearized Iran for the long term is not the right bet to make at this point.
Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors with breaking news and sharp analysis. Thanks to both of you for your insights. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington alongside Kailey Leinz. You're with us now on the Monday edition of Balance of Power. It may not seem like a Monday, but we are indeed still at the start of the week with breaking news as Iran retaliates against the U.S. Missiles intercepted so far without damage reports that we can tell you about here. This is the moment that Americans have been waiting for, certainly in this administration, but also in world capitals all over, with Iran now responding to the U.S. attacks that we saw take place over the weekend against Iranian nuclear facilities. Kailey, you wouldn't know in isolation by looking at the markets that this historic moment had arrived. There seems to be a sigh of relief on Wall Street that this was not more broad in scope, that it wasn't targeting energy facilities, and frankly, most of the missiles were intercepted.
Yeah, it seems the market's read on this, at least, is that this was a de-escalatory retaliation from Iran rather than an escalatory one. And certainly, of course, at least at this time, doesn't seem like they are choosing to take aim at energy infrastructure or global energy flows, hence the major move lower we are seeing in oil today. That said, they have still, by firing missiles directly at Qatar, brought in another player into this conflict with the U.S. And Israel, as Qatar has said, it reserves the right to respond directly to what they describe as this blatant attack, though we've also seen reporting that Qatar was informed in advance that Iran was planning to do this. So as we survey all of the different players in the Gulf here, we turn to one of our experts in Dubai. Bloomberg's Joumanna Bercetche is with us. She, of course, is anchor of Bloomberg TV's Horizons Middle East and Africa and is live with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Joumanna, how should we consider not just Qatar, but the UAE, Bahrain, who have now closed their airspaces, at least temporarily as well, and how all of the Gulf states are likely to look at this action from Iran?
Look, I will tell you the past couple of days have been extremely tense, not least the last hour when there are reports of those airspaces closing up both in Qatar and in the UAE. That really suggested that something was about to happen. We heard multiple witnesses report several explosions over Doha, so it wasn't imminently clear what was going on. But of course, now we understand that several missiles were fired towards that Al Udeid base. And then the Qatar Foreign Ministry putting out a statement quickly afterwards saying that they condemned this attack from the IRGC, very long statement, but then confirming right at the end that there were no injuries or human casualties that resulted from that attack. And so it seems as though we were in a situation where the attacks were very much telegraphed in advance. And that is reminiscent of the Iranian response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani back in 2020. Back then, there was about 5-6 days that the Iranian regime sat on their response, but they then decided to strike a U.S. base in Iraq. They telegraphed it beforehand. There were no fatalities recorded at the time, but it was a face-saving measure. And it seems as though, maybe too early to say, because sirens are still going off in Bahrain, the airspace here in the UAE is still closed, but it seems as though we are getting something akin to the reaction that we got in 2020.
And not unlike what we saw last year in the exchanges with Israel, Joumanna, when we knew long in advance that drones and ballistic missiles had been fired by Iran. The U.S., Axios is reporting, was made aware of the attack against our air base in Qatar. Are we witnessing Iran step back from the ledge? Is this the end of this standoff?
Well, the Iranian media are positing this as a retaliation to the U.S. strikes over the weekend. So perhaps insofar as the retaliation to the U.S. is concerned, this may be it. And of course, we're still awaiting to see what happens in the rest of the Gulf nations, if indeed something does happen. I mentioned those sirens in Bahrain and the fact that UAE airspace is closed. But from Qatar's standpoint, I just want to give you two factoids that I think are relevant also. I'm sure you're aware of the significance of Al Udeid base in the region, the largest U.S. base in the Gulf. But President Trump was standing at that exact same base 1 month ago when he made the trip around the region. It is a base of huge significance. And the second point is Qatar have been actively mediating the U.S.-Iran nuclear discussions. It's pretty surprising that Iran would go down the route of actually firing shots at a U.S. base in Qatar, which has been trying to play the diplomatic role. And actually, if you look at Qatar's response today, they're pretty angry at the Iranian regime. They said, we condemn this attack. And so as far as inter-regional politics are concerned, this may also mark a turning point as well.
Really interesting to get your input on this, Joumanna. It's great to have you live from Dubai with us on Balance of Power as we add another voice of experience. And in fact, one of the most prescient voices we've had on this program leading up to the strikes last week. He was with us just in advance of Israel making its action. Michael Allen with us from Beacon Global Strategies, where he's managing director and a veteran of the Bush White House, a national security expert who has seen this coming. Michael, it's good to have you back with us here in studio on Bloomberg. To what extent is Israel finishing the job right now as opposed to widening it?
So I think Israel is somewhere down their target list in terms of military and nuclear targets. And to me, they're beginning to hit more economic and regime stronghold targets. So I have a real question as the week goes on, because they're debating how long do we want to keep this going, whether they shift completely toward a regime change type policy. And to me, that's sort of the biggest question ongoing in the real war, which is between Israel and Iran.
Well, so when we consider that being the quote unquote real war, how long would you expect it to continue if Iran has already chosen its course of action against the U.S., or do you think it might not end against the U.S. at this point either?
I think it's basically over against the United States. They did their symbolic attack on Al Udeid Air Force Base, as your correspondent noted, completely telegraphed, probably coordinated between intermediaries. What I don't think, though, is that it's over with Israel. I think Israel, by the way, not only is going to continue to prosecute its target list, at least for this week and maybe beyond, but to me, as long as they have air superiority in Iran, I think Benjamin Netanyahu is going to carry on a campaign of where they have an opportunity that's going to be quite opportunistic. They're going to go for it. That's exactly what they do with Hamas, and that's what they do with Hezbollah. I think it's going to go on for weeks and weeks.
And we should note that they were trading fire as recently as today.
Yes.
That we spent a lot of time talking about Iran's response to the U.S., but Israel is still deep in this right now. You brought to us the importance of Fordo, knowing that this would be in our sights if, in fact, we decided to strike. It has now happened, and Bloomberg is reporting that satellite images that we've seen of that area following U.S. strikes show that the U.S. Air Force intentionally avoided hitting reactors at Fordo and Isfahan during the attack on Saturday night. What do you make of that decision, and does that imply to you that there is, in fact, more to be done here, that the deal is not closed to end the nuclear program in Iran?
So avoiding the reactors is smart because they don't want to cause some radioactive incident. Apparently, if you hit the stored uranium, it's not a big of a radioactive activity than hitting a reactor. But I do think that the United States still has some interest here in seeing that Israel continue to prosecute some of the nuclear targets going forward. I think it's fair to say no one is quite sure today where the HEU is. I know the Vice President mentioned on air yesterday that it might have been diverted before we hit.
This is the highly enriched uranium.
This is the 60% highly enriched uranium stockpile. All of this, to me, however, suggests something that I think the United States would be wise to set expectations better. It is true that we had a successful attack the other night. It is true that we probably could have hit some of these sites, and I wish we had hit Esfahan harder. But this program has been going on for decades. There are dozens and dozens of sites. The Iranians are experts at denial, deception, and subterfuge. It won't be outlandish to think that we might have missed something, or that the Israelis, as good as our intel is, might have missed something also. I think we just need to understand that we severely degraded them. We had totally lost the bubble on Iran in the last few years. We have regained the initiative, and it may just take a sustained effort from Israel over time to keep up.
Well, when we consider, and I know you said you think at least between the U.S. and Iran in terms of military action, it might be over for now. Iran still has non-military options available to it, like, for example, just stop cooperating and leave the treaty, the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Make sure the IAEA can't get eyes on anything. We asked John Bolton, the former national security advisor, about this last night on our special coverage, and he was like, well, they haven't been abiding by it anyway, so it's really not a concern. But I wonder if you view it the same way. Don't we need eyes on at least what we can see in regard to Iran's program?
So I think all told, it was good that we had IAEA inspection capability, but they didn't show us everything. And so at some level, it becomes confusing for the international community to think, well, the IAEA is in there, so we must have eyes on everything. We don't. They were letting us see what we wanted to see. And I think while it was beneficial to have it, over time, the usefulness declined because in the aggregate, the whole program got way out of whack. They had so much more HEU than they should have. They were reportedly building a third centrifuge site that they had only begun to mention to the IAEA. And all these weaponization sites, the Iranians have been shutting the IAEA out of those for years. So I think we set them back. I think the Israelis really are the ones that set them back on nuclearization. I hate to lose the IAEA, but I mean, all things equal, I think we're better off in the long run.
I've got a headline that just crossed the terminal. Kuwait says it now is temporarily closing its airspace. With everything that we've heard in the last hour, does this feel de-escalatory, as some have suggested on Iran's part, or are you still waiting to see if there's a fulfillment of this threat to activate sleeper cells, that there's a completely other element here that involves terror?
So I think over time, this is the primary tool that the Iranians have.
Terrorism?
Yes, they're a state sponsor of terrorism. I think they are flat on their backs. They have tried to assassinate U.S. officials over the last several years here and have failed. They tried to recruit people in chat rooms, and the FBI was onto them very quickly before anything materialized. I think over time, the Iranian regime will try to return to that, maybe to hit embassies overseas, certainly maybe targets of opportunity if they're soldiers that are unprotected. But I have a hard time seeing them succeed in a big way here in the United States. That's not to rule it out completely, because I know they want to get over here. But I really don't see it as a huge threat, because I believe that we have superior intelligence, as do the Israelis, to tap into their computer systems and get some sense of what they want to do to us long before it goes kinetic.
As we're tracking the markets here, Michael, it is worth noting we're down nearly 6% on both Brent and WTI futures right now. We're actually south of $70 a barrel on WTI, which is where we were before Israel's initial strike on Iran on June 13th. This is the lowest level we've seen since June 12th. As we consider now, and Joe just mentioned the headline, Kuwait has closed its airspace. Al Samaria TV is also saying Iraq has done the same, in addition to Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE. Yeah. If the airspace isn't safe, should operators of cargo vessels, of oil cargo specifically, feel that the Strait will be safe moving forward, the Strait of Hormuz?
Yeah, I don't think that the Iranians are really going to go and do the Strait of Hormuz for several reasons, in part because Oman owns half of it, in part because it would be taking off their nose to spite their face. I do wonder, though, if they're beginning to shut down the air space over Kuwait and elsewhere, maybe there are more attacks to come from the Iranians. Maybe they're going to try to take a shot at our base in Kuwait. They definitely did, by the way, in Iraq at Al-Assad. The question is all of this choreographed? I think it is, because the quickest way for the Iranians to lose control of the situation is to kill an American. And then I fully believe that Donald Trump would go extraordinarily kinetic on them. We have 3 carrier strike groups in the region, a half dozen air squadrons of F-35s. I think that is something that Trump would prosecute to the hardest. So I really doubt that they're sincerely trying to hit us.
All right, Michael Allen, great to have you as always. Managing Director at Beacon Global Strategies. Also, of course, former Special Assistant to President George W. Bush, serving in a national security capacity. We appreciate it. And as we consider the Strait of Hormuz and what we're seeing in oil prices today, again, down the better part of 6%, we want to turn to Bloomberg TV and Radio's resident commodities expert. Alix Steel is with us. She hosts Bloomberg Intelligence on Bloomberg Radio, as well as The Close on Bloomberg TV. So, Alix, obviously a pretty remarkable move to the downside when many came in today thinking that we might see a massive spike in oil prices because of concern in the Middle East. It seems that commodities traders, at least, are thinking this might be an all-clear sign.
Yeah, I guess if you take away the worst-case scenario, that's actually helpful for lower oil prices. A couple things to consider, though. One, Halima Croft at RBC said over the weekend that she would caution against that knee-jerk reaction that, quote, the worst is behind us. Now, the other factor to consider here, irrespective of the supply issue that may or may not happen with Iran, is the demand side. So there's been a lot of stockpiling by China, a lot of stockpiling by other countries within the West as well. Iran was also exporting a lot more than normal before these strikes took place, and China was really stockpiling them, meaning that they're not going to be that huge demand pull if something does happen to the oil supply. Second, JP Morgan says that without any drama, they see a mid-60s range for oil for the remainder of 2025. So in essence, a WTI at 69, there's still even a little bit more geopolitical premium baked in.
Boy, there seems like there's a heck of a lot of confidence without knowing what's going to happen next year. Alix, how much of this rides on this tit-for-tat ending here? We've talked about any number of attempts that Iran could make to interrupt energy flows. We've heard about the Strait of Hormuz and so forth. Are those all extreme scenarios that this market is ruling out?
I mean, pretty much at this point. Like, ruling out the Strait of Hormuz was really about taking out a lot of geopolitical risk premium within the oil price. That is clearly the absolute worst case scenario. There are some things that range, like if you take out 1.75 million barrels of oil a day, this is Goldman Sachs saying this, then you'd see oil rise to $90 a barrel. If the oil through the Strait of Hormuz were to drop by just 50%, remember 20 million barrels of oil a day of fuel and oil flows through that. Reduce that to 50%. And you could see oil maybe 10% higher for another 11 months. So clearly, that's the worst case scenario. That clearly is not happening at this moment. Can we rule it out altogether? Halima Croft says, no, you can't. But it doesn't mean that it actually will happen. Many say that that would wind up hurting everybody, including Iran. However, you have to make an argument, too, that why would Iran want to cut off any oil supply to China? But again, like I mentioned, China's been stockpiling, right? So the immediate impact might not be that bad. And when you have nothing to lose, there's still that risk that should be calculated within the market.
Alix Steel, what a treat to have Alix with us here on this program, the host of Bloomberg Intelligence on Bloomberg Radio, but of course our commodities expert, as Kailey mentioned. Thank you so much for the insights, Alix. Kailey, we're not done. We're going into overtime because this is still happening as we speak.
Indeed, it is. And the market is still reacting, not just in terms of lower oil prices, which we were just discussing, but actually higher stocks. We're up about 0.6% on the S&P 500, up 0.9% on the NASDAQ 100, as the market is reading Iran sending missiles toward a U.S. airbase in Qatar as a de-escalatory move. We're going to continue this analysis here on Bloomberg TV and Radio, so stick with us for a second extended hour of Balance of Power. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu, and this is Bloomberg.
Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast. You're going to have a lot to catch up on today. Go to Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe. You can also listen anytime at Bloomberg.com.
Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu.
Iran retaliates against the U.S., and the market reads it as de-escalatory. Welcome to a special extended edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Joe Mathieu in Washington. Iran having sent multiple missiles toward a U.S. airbase in Qatar, our largest in the Middle East, the Al Udeid airbase. Qatar largely successfully intercepting those missiles. And we're learning at this hour that the U.S. has said there are no reports of casualties at that base in the region.
This all just unfolding in the last hour and change, Kailey, pretty remarkable. As we were waiting for Iran's response, we now have at least the beginning of one, and we don't want to go too far to believe that this is over yet. But indeed, multiple missiles shot at U.S. air bases, U.S. military installations in the Middle East. No casualties at this hour. We have to remember as well that the president is watching this alongside his national security team from inside the Situation Room, and it is unclear what the administration's answer will be. Unclear as well if the administration will see this as de-escalatory as well.
Well, and other Gulf states' reactions are also something we need to consider here, as Qatar has said it reserves the right to respond to what it's describing as a blatant attack, even though they were warned in advance that Iran was going to be taking this measure. Saudi Arabia now has also come out and condemned Iran's, quote, aggression on Qatar, saying that it cannot be justified. Those headlines just crossing the Bloomberg terminal. We're, of course, keeping track of all of them for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio at this hour, which is why we're here in overtime on Balance of Power.
That's right. Welcome to special extended coverage here on Balance of Power. This is a market mover, Kailey. We've seen a remarkable reversal, and that goes for stocks as well as oil. Amy Morris has the markets covered for us. Let's start there, as always, with the latest on Wall Street. Amy?
All right, thank you, Joe. Stocks at session highs, oil at a session low as the Iran response is being seen as a market positive outcome. Iran fired missiles at a U.S. airbase in Qatar in retaliation for President Trump's weekend airstrikes. Now, the missile strike on Qatar was telegraphed. It had been expected. Qatar says they intercepted the missiles and that there were no casualties, which sent those oil prices lower and stocks higher. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. WTI now down a little more than 6%, trading at less than $70 per barrel. Brent crude down just about 6%, now about a little more than 6%, trading at more than $72 per barrel. And checking the markets now, the S&P 500 is 0.7% higher, NASDAQ 0.8% higher, the Dow 0.6% higher. Tariffs on pharmaceuticals could cost Ireland, which is a multinational hub for Pfizer and Eli Lilly, up to 75,000 jobs. The finance minister there warns that these tensions in the Middle East are adding more risk in the energy and trade sectors. Pfizer stock now little changed because those strikes by Iran didn't seem to do as much damage as was feared. Also, Eli Lilly shares are 0.7% higher. We're looking at the 10-year Treasury yield at 4.3%, the 2-year yield at 3.82%. Novo Nordisk ending its partnership with Hims & Hers Health because of what the drug company calls deceptive marketing of copycat versions of the obesity drug Wegovy. Shares of Hims & Hers Health now down 32%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back now to Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy, thank you so much. On the fastest show in politics, we'll keep tabs on markets as we make our way through this next hour, awaiting news from the White House, knowing that President Trump was set to be inside the Situation Room with his national security team. Beginning at 1 p.m. Eastern time, Kailey, there's reporting that they got in there early, that the Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who both briefed us on U.S. strikes against Iran yesterday morning, were there as well to watch this unfold. And we've seen a series of missiles fired from Iran toward U.S. installations in the Middle East, our largest, in fact, collection of military in Qatar. Those missiles were intercepted.
Yeah, and again, the signal from the U.S. is that there are no known casualties from this attempted attack by Iran, at least at this point. But we do have to keep in mind that President Trump did warn over the weekend that any retaliation from Iran would be met with, quote, force far greater than what was witnessed during the initial U.S. strike on Iran's military installation. So for more, we turn to Bloomberg White House editor Jordan Fabian, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. So the president had responded or said there would be a response to any retaliation, Jordan. But if there were no casualties, do we have a sense as to whether the president will actually feel compelled to do so for this?
Yeah, the big question about this strike is whether it's a face-saving measure by Iran or a signal of a larger escalation. And all the facts that you laid out point to this being a de-escalation, that they informed Qatar what was happening, no casualties. It seemed like the U.S. was pretty well prepared for what was going to happen. That gives President Trump an off-ramp not to respond. And for Israel as well, are they going to keep up these attacks that they've been carrying out on Iran? We'll have to wait and see what they say. Is Trump going to take it as what it appears to be is the big question, and I don't think we can say that at this early hour.
Noteworthy that we've not heard from President Trump since he was standing in the cross hall with Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Vice President in his address on Saturday evening. Presumably still in the Situation Room. Are we hearing anything about a public statement or an address from the president?
Currently, I don't think they have any plans to do anything. Obviously, this is a White House that changes on a dime, so that could happen today. We have heard from him a bit today on social media earlier before these attacks. He seemed to be very concerned about oil prices. I believe they actually went down as the market read the strikes as a de-escalation, but clearly people are in his ear about the possibility for this to inflict greater pain on American consumers if it balloons into a broader conflict.
Yeah, well, to mention oil, it is down on both Brent and WTI more than 6%. We're actually south of $70 a barrel on WTI once again. Jordan, when we consider that there obviously is a kind of an economic element of the political considerations for the president as he has decided to move through this strategically, there also is another political element, which is that there are at least some members of his base of the party who do not want to see the U.S. involved in a more material, elongated way in the Middle East. Could this kind of response from Iran give him cover to make sure that he does not have to get more interventionist and risk upsetting some of those individuals?
Yeah, it certainly could. They are clearly giving him, again, an off-ramp here, and he's hearing it from members of the base. You saw Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Georgia congresswoman, post almost a novel on Twitter this morning decrying this attack. And so given the economic pressures and the possibility this could split his base, he could say that he was going to follow through on what he promised. This is a limited attack to ensure that Iran's nuclear program is eliminated and not some sort of broader escalation. Now, he did say, raise the prospect of regime change. He's clearly threatening a lot more. Now, we'll have to see whether that was actually a leverage play or that signaled something broader about his intentions.
This does seem to be something of a smaller scale than most expected. We've got a third carrier strike group on the way to the region right now, presumably for deterrence. These strike groups wouldn't be activated for something of this scale, we presume. Is that how you're looking at it?
Yeah, I would think so, that it's a precautionary measure. Yeah. Some of these strike group movements are actually planned weeks and months in advance and might not have anything to do with the current conflict. But that being said, I'm sure that military leadership is looking back to 2020 when they see this response, when the U.S. under President Trump took out Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. Iran responded with a limited attack on a U.S. military installation in Iraq, and then essentially said, okay, that's a one and done. We've gone tit for tat. And so there is a playbook for this kind of de-escalation, and U.S. military leaders who've been there, saw that happen, I'm sure are seeing the same signals again.
Great. Jordan, great to have you. Jordan Fabian, of course, our White House editor, a very busy man here in Washington, D.C. We thank you for the insights. It's just after 10 p.m. local time in Dubai where we find Dana Khraiche, Bloomberg News, breaking news editor, on a pretty important day here that we want to spend some time talking about. Dana, thanks for being with us on Balance of Power. The latest here from your point of view, at 10 p.m. local time in Dubai, we still have what could be a long night throughout the Middle East. Are we to believe that this is all that Iran is going to throw in the air?
Yes, hi. Pretty tense night here in the Gulf, not just in Dubai, I would say in Qatar, in Kuwait, in Bahrain. All of those have closed their airspace, and that's not something you see a lot, especially in the Gulf states. If this is what it is for Iran, then it was very well telegraphed, and we saw the Iranians come out and say, this is just, we have really good relations with Qatar. We're not here to ruin these ties, because they do, and Qatar is among the few that actually has regular visits from Qatar and from Iranian officials back and forth. And they're saying, this is just targeting U.S. base. It has nothing to do with the Qataris. And of course, that statement from the Qatar Foreign Ministry spokesperson who said, signaling that the airbase was cleared before the attack. So this means this was well telegraphed, just like that 2020 Iran attack on the U.S. base in Iraq after Qasem Soleimani's killing, as Jordan was referring to. So this is pretty much telegraphed. And if this is what it is, then that would be contained to here. If, of course, President Trump wants it to stay there, wants to kind of close this chapter of tit for tat and move on to possibly a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, or more of that back to the negotiating table. But from a Gulf perspective, to be honest, these are countries that are trying to transform their economies. They want to be financial center hubs, especially in Doha. And so this kind of airspace closure, fear among residents and foreigners, and Dubai, most of them are expats. This hasn't happened before, I'd say. So this fear is very new to people in the Gulf. And this is the escalation, is that you would allow Iran to do that, even if it was telegraphed.
How, Dana, should we consider the idea that this airbase that Iran tried to strike, yes, is home to thousands of U.S. troops, but also to Qatari Air Forces, to the Royal Air Force? Is this also potentially meant to send a signal to Gulf allies of the United States that there is risk to aligning so closely with U.S. military interests in the region?
Well, 100%. I think that what the Iranians are saying, that yes, we have improved ties in the past with Qatar, with the UAE, and especially with Saudi Arabia, right? We've improved these ties. We have delegations back and forth. We're looking into economic cooperation. But when such an attack from the U.S. on my soil will happen, then I'm going to retaliate against you guys. And this is, of course, due to Iran's limited capabilities. I mean, what's close to it is Qatar, is UAE, is Bahrain. And so the easiest targets would be there. But there are also other targets, right? There's one in Jordan and Syria. They haven't withdrawn from there. There's also Iraq. So this message that Iran is sending is definitely going to impact the ties that it has worked so hard to improve between Tehran and its Gulf neighbors.
All right, Dana, we appreciate you joining us at a late hour in the Middle East. She is Dana Khraiche of Bloomberg News, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we have been waiting to see what we will hear from the White House and from President Trump in the aftermath of this Iranian retaliation against the U.S. And we did just get a Truth Social post from the president. However, it is not about missiles being sent toward a U.S. airbase in the Middle East. Instead, it seems to be a condemnation of the media for its reporting around whether or not the U.S. was fully able to destroy Iran's nuclear sites. To read it, quote, "The sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed and everyone knows it. Only the fake news would say anything different in order to try and demean as much as possible, and even say they were, quote, pretty well destroyed." He calls out, Joe, a number of individuals from various media organizations and goes on to say it never ends with the sleazebags in the media, and that's why their ratings are at an all-time low, zero credibility. There is also zero mention of missiles being sent toward U.S. forces in the Middle East, or of troops that were potentially put in harm's way as a result of Iran's retaliation.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV, giving you a shot of that Truth Social post, I guess we can assume that the president has concluded his meeting in the Situation Room, or is at least taking a break now that he's got access to his personal phone again. Seems to be consumed with the coverage of the first round of strikes, not so much about what's happening right now. It is an interesting moment here as we wait to see if Iran is complete or is through with its retaliation, having targeted bases in the Middle East, namely the massive U.S. air installation in Qatar. No U.S. casualties so far, Kailey. He didn't mention that as well.
He did not. So we want to get reaction from our political panel, who is back with us in this extended edition of Balance of Power. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, both of them Bloomberg Politics contributors. Rick is a partner at Stonecourt Capital, and Jeanne is Senior Democracy Fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Rick, when we consider what we just heard from the president, the first thing we hear from him in the aftermath of Iran sending missiles toward a military installation in the Middle East, knowing we haven't heard from him verbally, at least, since he told the nation about his decision to attack the nuclear sites late on Saturday night. Does a country that may be concerned about war in this region, that may be concerned about asymmetric actions Iran could still take in regard to terrorism, need to hear more from the commander-in-chief?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I mean, he bristles over criticism and the idea that he could put together such an effective military operation in total secrecy and not get everybody fawning of praise, some questioning, how long it's going to take to really assess the damage done, especially at Fedor, echoed by his own chief of Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Kane, who said it's going to take us a while to really assess the damage. That's just standard operating procedure, but we know Donald Trump does not adhere to standard operating procedure. He wants his victory lap. So, yeah, I am not surprised he's stewing off the coverage he's seen. It doesn't take any, it doesn't blemish the initiative that he took and the outcomes. They are what they're going to be. If you've ever seen a explosion by one of these 30-ton ordinances, you wouldn't imagine anything other than total destruction would occur. And when you have multiple ones dropped on any facility ever created by man, you would really be suspect to think that anything would survive, any structure or individual. So, look, the Iranians said that they dropped in the same number of weapon bombs that the United States dropped on them, they dropped on Qatar. And to me, that's sounding like, okay, this is all we're going to do. So for them to light up a terrorist front around Western targets would really escalate this thing. And I think the one thing that the Khomeini has been very adept at is not getting into a direct confrontation, with the United States.
Jeanne, what do you make of this post here? The president is not only talking, as Kailey mentioned, about whether the nuclear installation was destroyed, but he's calling out by name specific members of the media, even reaching to the C-suite here. Dumb Brian Roberts, he writes, chairman of Comcast, helped to continue this falsehood. Where are we going here in this moment for Donald Trump to be consumed by what the media is reporting or thinking as he emerges from the Situation Room and Iran firing at U.S. forces in the Middle East?
There's a very simple way for Donald Trump to address this obsession with the media, and that is to show us the evidence. He claimed that it was obliterated. We have not seen that evidence yet, and it is not enough to just keep saying something. You have to show the evidence. And there's nothing stopping the president, once they get the evidence, from providing that to the media. Just like there was nothing stopping the president Saturday night when he came out and telling us why he made the decision to bomb a country. What was the imminent threat we were facing? What is the threat to the United States? Very few people in the U.S. disagree with the president on the objective of denuclearizing Iran. The question is how best to do it. He decided, for reasons that we still aren't really privy to, that he had to go in Saturday night and bomb them. And so it is fair for the media and the American public to say, did you achieve your objective? And so, this is pretty typical, not just of Donald Trump, but any president. They don't like the media to be the fourth branch of government, but that's what the media is supposed to do. We don't just accept what people say and claim. We provide evidence, and the president can provide that, and he should as soon as it is available.
Well, as we look to see whether or not we will get that evidence, either from the U.S., from Israel, from the IAEA, or any other authority on that, we also are keeping track of how the markets have reacted to the events of this afternoon or this evening in the Middle East, with oil down 6.6% on both Brent and WTI, and stocks actually on the rise, though we're still seeing a bit of what could be described as a haven bid into U.S. Treasuries. To get back to how this conflict moves forward, Rick, if this is the end of it between the U.S. and Iran, and this gets to the point that Jeanne was just making around the president having decided without seeking congressional authority to bomb another country, does this put to bed the concerns around constitutionality of the president's actions here, of the effort we've seen, frankly, in both chambers, in the House and the Senate, to try to force votes on war powers resolutions? If this is all, as far as this goes, do you think those things will be seen as necessary still on the Hill?
No, I think that it was a pretty specious argument on the Hill. I think Lindsey Graham handled it pretty well this weekend on Sunday shows, talking about how, within Article 2 of the Constitution, the commander-in-chief has exhaustive powers on dealing with the military and making decisions like this. And he pointed out it wasn't that long ago that Democrats were applauding Barack Obama for doing very similar things in Syria and Iraq and in other places in the Middle East, where he launched attacks that were unauthorized by Congress, and no Democrat complained. So I think this is business as usual, politics playing itself out on national security issues. It's unfortunate, but it is standard operating procedure, and I don't think it goes anywhere from here.
President's supposed to fly away to the annual NATO Leaders Summit tomorrow, Jeanne, presuming he still attends. How does this last 48 hours change the conversation he's going to be having with world leaders at an event, say, a month ago, would have been focused squarely on Ukraine, Russia, and the spending on defense by each member of NATO?
Yeah, this has quickly vaulted up to the number one issue on the agenda. We hear the president is still going to go. It would be understandable if he decided he couldn't leave the country at this point. But I do think it is important. What distinguishes one of the many things that the president did over the weekend, and what we've seen in the recent past, is that other presidents, Republicans and Democrats, have consulted allies. I mean, Kailey was just talking about the lack of consultation to Democratic members of Congress in this context. He didn't consult allies either. This is a president who is not only an interventionist, but he wants to go it alone. And I bring up again Andrew Jackson, because Donald Trump has described him as one of his favorite presidents. And this is very much in the Jacksonian mode. We can do it, and we can do it alone. And I think the allies are going to have a lot to say on that. And just to go back to the War Powers Act, Rick mentioned Article 2, rightly so. The president is the commander-in-chief. But we also have an Article 1, Section 8, which says Congress has the power to declare war. And the administration is falling over itself to say this isn't a war. But when you attack another country, by international law and by most people's assessment of U.S. law, you have engaged in a war. And so it is not as simple as saying the president is the commander-in-chief, he can do whatever he wants. That's simply not how the U.S. Constitution was written or how we should operate. That said, this is a Congress, and Rick is right on this, which has gone along with presidents for a long time. My view is if you want to do that, then change the Constitution or write a law which allows the president to act unilaterally. We don't have that now. And so this has likely been a violation of U.S. international law and UN standards and operating procedures.
Analysis from our panel in overtime with Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributors. We thank you both for staying with us here on extended special coverage on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Coming up, our conversation with Joseph Rodgers, nuclear expert at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
We're, of course, here on Balance of Power, not just tracking the reaction of markets, but also the reaction of the President of the United States, though we have yet to hear from him on Iran's retaliation and attempted missile strike on the U.S. Udeid Air Base in Qatar. We have heard from him on the initial strike that the U.S. conducted over the weekend. He just posted on Truth Social, in part criticizing media coverage of the extent to which those strikes were successful in destroying Iran's nuclear capacity. The first line of his Truth Social post, Joe, reads, "The sites that we hit in Iran were totally destroyed and everyone knows it." The thing is, Not everyone does know that definitively. In fact, we have not seen any source that suggests that there has been a complete destruction of Iran's nuclear capability, just like we don't know for certain where exactly Iran's stockpile of already enriched uranium is at this point in time.
These are big questions that we are seeking answers to with an expert in the matter. Joseph Rodgers is Deputy Director Fellow, the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And Joseph, we welcome you to our conversation. Thanks for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. As Kailey mentioned, the president says the sites we hit in Iran were totally destroyed and everyone knows it. What will it take for you at CSIS to agree?
So it looks like from the satellite images that are commercially available, some of the key enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz have been pretty effectively destroyed with about 14 massive ordnance penetrators, really big bombs, bunker busters. Yeah. But as I think you mentioned, the really key question that we're focusing on is that previous stockpile of 60% enriched uranium that Iran had announced, that the IAEA announced that Iran had on June 12th. The location of that 60% enriched uranium is unknown. It's about 400 kilograms, and if it enriched up to 90%, it would be enough for 10 nuclear weapons. So Iran's current centrifuge facilities are probably pretty well destroyed, but they could have clandestine facilities in the near future.
Well, so walk us through what it actually will take to get to 60 to 90%, because my very rudimentary understanding, Joseph, is actually that leap may not be as great as it seems.
No, that's correct. Yes. Once you've reached about 60% enrichment, getting from 60 to 90 really just takes a number of days. It depends on how many centrifuges you have spinning, how big your facility is, and a number of other technical details. But getting to 90% enrichment would not take too long. Now, just having 90% enriched uranium is a few steps removed from actually having a workable nuclear device. There's a lot of sophisticated sort of weaponeering that would go into making a nuclear device, and especially having a credible deterrent. Having 10 nuclear weapons without being able to put them on warheads and put them on missiles would not really count as like a credible nuclear deterrent. But of course, it would be a very worrying development in the region and would indicate that Iran has wider proliferation intents in the future.
Give us a sense, if we can get even more granular on this, Joseph. How large is this stockpile? Would it fit on a pallet in the back of a truck? How difficult is it to transport? How difficult is it to shield, knowing that this is obviously a highly radioactive package we're talking about?
Yeah, so 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium probably weighs about 900 pounds. It could fit on the back of several trucks, but it would require some sophisticated logistics and military support to move it around. Right on June 12th, right before the first Israeli attacks, Iran had announced that they were preparing for the operation of a third centrifuge facility, a third enrichment facility. That location, the Director General of the IAEA was supposed to visit it early after June 12th, but the war has prevented that visit from happening. So it looks like Iran was prepared to start a third enrichment facility. The two previously known enrichment facilities at Fordow and Natanz have probably been destroyed, but there's obviously work for a third facility.
Well, so when we consider this kind of question as to what will happen with this enriched uranium, even if it were to be located and there was the ability to destroy it without, massive fallout, if there was the ability for Israel to finish what it and the U.S. started and actually eliminate the vast majority of Iran's nuclear infrastructure and capability, that knowledge doesn't just go away, right? Joseph, how easily could Iran actually restart a program with the knowledge that it already has around how to enrich uranium and how to advance its objectives in this area?
So it's a little difficult to assess right now, but it is very clear that the ongoing attacks by Israel and the U.S. have put some pretty significant, at least temporary, halts to significant progress in Iran's nuclear program. Over the longer term, I believe that if there's not a diplomatic solution, this conflict will galvanize significant greater political will in Tehran to pursue nuclear ambitions. That's why it's so important that we resolve this conflict in a diplomatic solution that creates a verifiable deal that limits Iran's nuclear future.
Is this stockpile one of the few nuclear bargaining chips that Iran has, as the New York Times suggested this morning?
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, one of the key sort of aspects that the Trump administration, J.D. Vance even noted earlier that in future talks with Iran, the administration was prioritizing looking at Iran's existing stockpile of uranium, indicating that the U.S. doesn't think that it's destroyed that 60% rich 400 kilograms. So yes, it certainly is going to be a bargaining chip that Iran could play in future diplomatic efforts to resolve this conflict.
And Joseph, finally, as we consider here the diplomatic effort that could move forward and just diplomatic institutions or international institutions overall, Iran's parliament obviously has advocated for leaving the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, which would end all insight that the IAEA has into its program. It's been suggested to us by the likes of John Bolton, the former national security advisor here on Balance of Power, that Iran already wasn't abiding by or adhering to that treaty in its entirety. So even if it pulled out, it wouldn't be that consequential. But what is your actual assessment of that question? What if it does indeed decide to leave?
Well, if Iran decides to leave the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, that would have some pretty significant ripple effects in the international community and would really cripple or exacerbate future efforts at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. The NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is really the cornerstone of diplomatic efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Only one country has entered the treaty and then ultimately withdrew later. That was North Korea. And the treaty, it was a massive obstacle for the NPT to overcome North Korea's withdrawal. If Iran decides to withdraw, then the NPT will come under tremendous strain. There's going to have to be really concerted effort to preserve the nuclear non-proliferation norms and come up with more robust efforts to prevent nuclear weapons spreading in the future.
All right, Joseph, we really appreciate you joining us. Joseph Rodgers, Deputy Director and Fellow of the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, with us on this extended edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much. And as we continue our coverage here, Joe, we do want to bring you the latest reporting from Reuters. Reuters is now reporting that Iran is going to continue its retaliation to U.S. attacks, citing a senior Iranian official on that. So the suggestion that this may have begun and ended with this attempted missile attack on U.S. air bases, including, of course, Udeid Air Base in Qatar, it may not be over, though the market certainly has been reading it as such, with oil down, settling down more than 7.5% on the day, and equities still higher even in light of this headline.
There's still a lot of questions about what type of capacity Iran has to respond and whether these smaller waves of missile attacks might be what we see, knowing that, as we discussed with retired General Frank McKenzie last week ahead of the strikes, that Iran, in fact, following heavy strikes by Israel, is short of things like cranes to load missiles onto launch pads, may not be capable of sending a massive barrage of missiles toward U.S. air bases. So we're just going to have to wait and see, much like they are doing from inside the Situation Room at the White House.
Yeah, a very good point. And as we do so, we want to add the voice now of Marc Champion, Bloomberg Opinion International Affairs columnist, who is joining us here on Balance of Power. Marc, when we consider the prospect, again, and this is Reuters reporting this, that Iran may not have yet completed everything it intends to in retaliation for the U.S. airstrikes over the weekend, is the market, which seems to be signaling the all clear right now, whistling past the graveyard?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it was really significant that the Iranians signaled what they were going to do, gave the Qataris, time, for example, to close the airspace, to get ready to shoot down the missiles, which they did. And also that they, made a point of saying that, we have fired the same number of missiles as the large bombs that were dropped by the U.S. So it's, that's a very clear signal that, we're not trying to escalate. Now, what the Iranians say separately in terms of rhetoric, they're very, at home saying how successful these strikes were, that, it was an aggressive response. They have to sell to their own people, especially in the regime, sort of harder line characters who've been calling for tougher responses, for dashing for the bomb and all that sort of thing. They have to keep those people satisfied, and also it doesn't hurt at all for them to keep the U.S. aware that anything else that happens, they still have the capacity to respond. And I think the last thing I'd say is that just on that is that. Iran, it has always seen itself as, excelling in asymmetric warfare. So, things like shooting missiles, that's conventional warfare. It's been demonstrated pretty clearly that they aren't able to compete with Israel, let alone the U.S. In a kind of head-to-head battle, exchanging fire with aircraft and missiles and so on. But they, historically, they've tended to hit back when they really wanted to, with terrorist attacks, using proxies, these kinds of things. So I think that's the sort of signal, the warning that they're sending.
Interesting. As I'm looking at the bulletin from the National Terrorism Advisory System from the Department of Homeland Security, the summary of threat to the United States refers to the ongoing Iran conflict causing a heightened threat environment. We do know that, according to reporting at least, there was a threat from Iran to activate sleeper cells here in the United States that was delivered through a third party to Donald Trump at the G7 in Canada. That was shortly before he cut his trip short. How seriously are you taking the threat of terrorism here at home?
I think it is. It is a very serious threat. It's the most, it is the area where Iran can be most effective, to be, very clear about it. As I say, they are kind of overmatched in conventional military terms. But I think what one has to bear in mind is that, always for the regime in Iran, the number one priority is regime survival. That's how they will look at it. And they will be aware that if they carry out a terrorist attack, in D.C. or some other place, Americans die, there will be a conventional response from the United States. And it isn't necessarily a war that the Iranians want to get into. We're going to find out. The difficult part about all of this is that when you start this kind of military action, it's very difficult to control where you go. The other side always has a vote. And the other part is that we don't know really what the end game is for the Israeli operations. And we're not completely clear, therefore, what the end game will be for the U.S. As your former, previous guest was saying, it's hard to be sure that you've eliminated a nuclear program. So the whole purpose of this, the kind of clean ending where you say mission accomplished, it's quite difficult to, say that with any confidence. And so long as you can't, you're kind of, presented with the same problem. You still need a diplomatic solution. You still need the Iranians to agree to give up things that they've said they wouldn't. It's not clear that they will immediately capitulate. So I think, we do have a little further to go, but I would say that the response the Iranians gave, that missile response, talking about the number of missiles and so on, it's very encouraging. I think the remarkers are probably right to be relieved. It's quite encouraging in terms of what they intend at this moment, at least.
Well, Marc, I want to expand on your point that Iran's number one focus, at least for the regime here, is regime survival, knowing that administration officials from the Secretary of State, J.D. Vance, or Marco Rubio, and the Vice President, J.D. Vance, yesterday took great pains when appearing on various television shows to say that the objective of the U.S. is not regime change here. The president did post on Truth Social yesterday, it's not politically correct to use the term regime change, to quote him, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? When we consider that question, Marc, how should we be thinking about the domestic pressures and forces within Iran itself and how that could influence what happens moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I mean, I think there are two things to say. One is that, the history of trying to force regime change that from the outside by force and to create a sort of, positive regime change where you move from an autocracy or a dictatorship to something more democratic. It's not a very successful one. And the second thing is to say that, we know what the elements are that tend to make it more successful. And among those are, a regime that has lost the will to kill, to remain in power, is vulnerable. There's, it's more vulnerable if there is an organized opposition already, existing, so that there's someone to take over. There are a number of things like that we know that those things make it much more likely that you will have something positive in terms of regime change if it can be, and it's more likely to happen. This is an old and tired regime, so in that sense, it's vulnerable. But those elements don't apply. They still have the will to kill. They demonstrated it, very often. They still have security forces that are, willing to do great damage. And they still, there is no organized opposition. They have made sure that that's the case. So I would say that if that is the end game, we're in trouble.
I want to point everyone to Marc Champion's column, Iran's Clerics Are in Charge of Our Future Now. Find it on the Terminal or online. Plug in OPI and go. Reporting for Bloomberg Opinion on international affairs. Marc Champion, thank you so much for being with us today. With breaking news today on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. We are waiting for any other response from Iran, having seen a series of missiles shot at U.S. bases throughout the Middle East, including our largest collection of U.S. forces in Qatar. If you're just joining us, those missiles were intercepted. No U.S. casualties, according to officials so far. But that doesn't mean we're done as we get into the late night hours, of course, in the Middle East.
We've just gotten some reporting from Reuters indicating that Iranian officials say that retaliation may not be over yet. In fact, it could continue, which is an important consideration here, Joe, is that this may not be over in its entirety between the U.S. and Iran, or Israel and Iran, for that matter.
That's right, which is why we should keep early analysis of this being de-escalatory somewhat in check here. We could see a lot more, not only from Tehran, but its proxies, Kailey, with a warning going out today from the Department of Homeland Security about the possibility of terrorism, including right here at home. We want to get the point of view of the Iranian people with so much casual talk, Kailey, about regime change. Alan Eyre is Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute and joins us live now on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alan, thank you for joining us. What are the people of Iran thinking tonight as they go to bed?
Although I am an Iran expert, I'd be hard-pressed to give you a declarative sentence on what all the Iranian people are thinking at this point. That's a very hard generalization, but if forced to, I will say the Iranian people want the bombing to stop. I mean, what's happening for the last 10 days has been tremendously wrenching for the people of the major cities, especially Tehran. And I think irrespective of how they feel towards their government, they're looking for hostilities to end so they could go back to their daily way of life. I think there's no evidence that these hostilities have weakened support for the current Iranian regime in any sort of significant way.
Well, so then let's talk about what the regime ultimately wants. As it's been made clear by the Trump administration and by President Trump, he would like to see the regime rejoin the negotiating table to reach a deal on its nuclear capabilities. Alan, you, of course, were a member of the negotiating team on the JCPOA from 2010 until its completion in 2015. The current president, of course, during his first administration, made the decision to pull out of that agreement. What real incentive, what real prospect do you see for Iran remaking that kind of accord in light of the actions of the United States over the last few days?
Well, Iran certainly wants to rejoin or to revive the diplomatic process. It's willing to accept drastic modifications on its nuclear program. It's willing to accept increased transparency, increased verification by the IAEA. It's not willing to accept no enrichment on Iranian soil. And that's why the talks broke down, because the U.S. was insisting that there be no enrichment on Iranian soil, whereas that was a bridge too far for the Iranians. But the key driver here is Israel. I think there could well be a difference between war goals of the United States government and the Israeli government. The Israeli government has shown no signs that it's slowing down. I think this morning or yesterday said they're in the midst of military actions. It's going to continue. Their goal explicitly has not been just the nuclear program and the missile program, but also destabilizing the current Iranian regime. So what Israel wants and whether Israel is willing to let diplomacy try to play a role, that's the key question.
We had Yoav Gallant on with us earlier today, Alan, and tried to probe the idea of Israeli ground forces entering Iran. Is that something that you're allowing for? Would Benjamin Netanyahu pursue an occupation of parts of Iran?
That's a tremendously bad idea. I mean, Iran is a huge country. It's got 92 million people. To be honest, I don't know what exactly the Israeli endgame is, but talking about any other country trying to put boots on the ground in Iran would inevitably lead to a drastic destabilization of the region.
Well, for our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Alan, obviously they're not only worried about destabilization of the region, but more specifically destabilization of energy flows out of the region. We've seen a massive move in oil prices today, down more than 7% on the expectation that if Iran has chosen this course of action against U.S. military assets, perhaps it will not choose what was seen as a dramatic course of action in terms of choking off the Strait of Hormuz. Would you rule that out entirely at this point, knowing administration officials have suggested that Iran won't make that move because it would be economically suicidal?
Kailey, I don't rule anything out at this point. We're really into unknown territory, but I think it's highly, highly unlikely that Iran would seek to close the Straits of Hormuz for the very same reasons that you enumerate. Not only would it be an economic own goal and cripple Iran's imports, it would also irritate Iran's Gulf allies. And I think Iran is still depending on its Gulf allies to lobby the U.S. administration for an end to hostilities, so they want to keep them in their good graces as much as they can.
I want to ask you about the 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium that has apparently gone missing, presumably moved from one of the nuclear sites that we struck over the weekend. Alan, if this is in fact a bargaining chip for Iran, how does it use it?
I mean, this was one of the mistakes Iran made, which is when President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. After that, they started enriching the uranium they had to 60%. And there's no valid reason to do that for a civilian nuclear program. So, yes, it's impossible kinetically by dropping bombs, shooting rockets to eliminate Iran's nuclear program. You can engage in a game of whack-a-mole. You've taken out some of the facilities. Iran can rebuild the facilities. They can, as they have done, move the parts or the resources, the uranium that's movable. So at the end of the day, unless you're willing to put boots on the ground, and a lot of them, you're not going to be able to eliminate Iran's capacity to reconstitute a nuclear program once the bombing stops. And you may well indeed, conversely, increase their desire to weaponize.
All right, Alan, we appreciate you joining us with your insights on this extended edition of Balance of Power. Alan Eyre is Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute, here with us on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we're now joined live by another important guest. General David Deptula is with us, retired Lieutenant General in the U.S. Air Force and now Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power Studies. General, thank you so much for your time. As we consider you are joining us in the aftermath, having just less than 3 hours ago, Iran having sent multiple missiles toward the U.S.'s largest military installation in the Middle East, a move that some have been describing as symbolic, but did stand a real chance of putting U.S. personnel in harm's way. Just walk us through the significance of that kind of target in particular, and what risk you still see to U.S. forces elsewhere in the region.
Well, Joe and Kailey, thanks very much for having me on. I think you kind of, it's a great segue into the question, given that Al Udeid Air Base is the biggest U.S. military installation in the region. So the Iranian response was not unexpected. A matter of fact, in recent weeks, many of the base's aircraft and personnel have been evacuated. So, and I apologize, I should have turned off my phone. But
no worries. A lot of people seeking your expertise, I'm sure, General.
Well, what we saw from Iran is a calculated face-saving move. It's not a serious military escalation. Supposedly, they fired the same number of missiles as we dropped bombs, but there was no damage caused, no casualties, and they even gave gutter advance warning. And so what I'd share with you is that's not warfighting, that's theater. They're trying to save face. Now the question becomes, what's the next step? I would tell you the United States to date has already achieved its objective. I mean, we struck Iran's nuclear infrastructure with precision and professionalism, and now is the time to exercise some strategic restraint. Because by not escalating further, we reinforce our dominance and demonstrate that our actions were about security, not vengeance. Although there's still a lot of runway out ahead of what's going to happen in this particular operation. But the other piece, I think, and forgive me because I haven't been watching, but I understand that Saudi Arabia has now come out and really scolded Iran for their actions, as has Qatar and UAE. So that's pretty game-changing in the context of now Iran has got all the GCC states essentially coalesced together in decrying their actions, and it's putting Iran in a box. So I think it's just a matter of time before hopefully the Iranian mullahs see the errors in their ways and do what's in the best interest of their people, and that is to halt their aspirations for building nuclear weapons and move on to an option that would see peace and security established in the region.
General, you were with us just less than a week ago talking about the run-up to this actual event happening with the U.S. surging an enormous amount of resources, military equipment and personnel into the region. We still have a third carrier strike group that's on its way. And as someone who's spent hundreds of hours in the cockpit of a combat aircraft, I wonder your thoughts on how long we can keep this level of presence in a crouched position in the Middle East and the risks that come with doing so.
Well, it's a great question. First, let me just highlight and add what I'm sure you've heard a lot of people say, but I got to tell you, the air attacks on Saturday deserve an A+ in terms of performance. And by the way, not just the air crews that participated, but the folks in the entire CENTCOM planning staff and the U.S. National Security Team. I mean, the operations security and the deception that was pulled off and executed is just spectacular. There's no other way to say it. Now, the other point that I will add is this is an extraordinarily difficult mission to plan and execute, but all the people that participated made it look easy. But we have to remember it was actually very, very complex and dangerous. Now, back to answering directly your question. Look, we've been in the region since 1991. People tend to forget that. It wasn't just 9/11 when we started this. We've had aircrew members flying no-fly zone operations since the end of Operation Desert Storm. So we've been there a long time. And we've demonstrated that we can project power. But there is something behind the scenes that people generally are not aware of. And what's not evident in this magnificent air combat performance is if we had to do it again today or tomorrow or even in a week or for a sustained period of time, we couldn't. That's because the United States Air Force today is the oldest, the smallest, and the least ready it's been in its history. What your audience might not know is that the United States only has 19 B-2s. They're all over 30 years old. And the B-52, our largest bomber force element, just celebrated the 73rd birthday of its first flight. So what you saw unfold on Saturday was about the maximum operational stealth bomber force that could be generated in a one-day attack. And at the same time, we expended over half of the GBU-57 weapons inventory. So the Air Force is in a force structure and weapons inventory crisis, and it needs to be rebuilt if America wants to retain and grow this capability to perform more than a one-and-done operation in the future.
Well, that's fascinating context, and we appreciate it as we consider that aspect of U.S. capability in our final 90 seconds here. General, what about Iran and Israel's capability to keep this going in a sustained way? At what point do we reach the point in which they cannot continue volleying at each other with the same velocity?
It's just a matter of time. Israel is winning. They are changing the calculus in the region by putting Iran in a box, by halting their means of aggression, and quite frankly, our U.S. security objectives align with theirs in this regard after our successful attacks. We're now full partners. Now, what that also, it doesn't mean that we've got to enter into a supposed forever war like those we got involved in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a different set of circumstances, and they're applying precision air and space power to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. It's going to work, and this is going to be over. One can't tell exactly when, but they will succeed.
General, it's great to have you back. David Deptula, retired Lieutenant General, U.S. Air Force, now Dean of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Power Studies. Fascinating conversation and a deep dive with David Deptula. Thanks for being with us for our extended Balance of Power coverage live from Washington. We're going to be back with more in just a couple of hours. 5 p.m. Eastern Time for the late edition of Balance of Power. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Joe Mathieu. Stay with us for much more on Bloomberg.